And really, I think one of the champions here in Brussels who really is fighting hard for the cause of cultural diplomacy. So I'm hoping in the context of her keynote address, we can also learn more about some of the initiatives that she has. But I think it's quite impressive. I think it was already 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago, the big event that you also organized in honor of cultural diplomacy. So in many reasons, Marietta Giannakou is, for me, one of the champions of cultural diplomacy here in Brussels. So in that sense, perfect fit for the conference. I'd like to say a few words of background about her before I introduce her with her keynote address. Ms. Marietta Giannakou holds a BA in Liberal Arts from Wittenberg University, Ohio, in the United States. She also holds an MA in American Studies from the University of Amsterdam. She served on the International Strategic Planning Committee from 2004 until 2007, was a founding member of the American Chamber of Commerce Young Professional Network from 2007 until 2009, and a founding member of the British Council Transatlantic Network 2020 from 2008 until 2009. She's also a member of the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Forum on Migration and Integration from 2008 until 2009. She's currently a member of the European Parliament, representing the Dutch Democratic Party, and as I said, quite an avid supporter, I think, of culture and also the role of cultural diplomacy in the European context. So if you could please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Ms. Marietta Giannakou. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome you here in the European Parliament. I currently work in 3 committees here, which is the Foreign Affairs Committee, the International Trade Committee, and the committee that deals with culture. And whereas a parliament sometimes requires sort of strict organization, I believe that the world is so interconnected and so many of these topics overlap that I usually work in the overlap of these subjects. So I try to strengthen Europe's digital internal market, take away the barriers that still exist in order for Europe to be able to compete for talent and for innovation on a global scale. But I also look at issues like internet freedom, because I believe technologies play an ever larger role in both enhancing opportunities for the next generation of leaders, human rights defenders, students, journalists, entrepreneurs, and basically people everywhere. And at the same time, we see increasing threats to people's fundamental rights and freedoms with the use of technologies. So in other words, it's a big overlap between those subjects. Today is a pretty important day because there will be a ministerial conference in the Netherlands which will deal with internet freedom, so I have to go there as soon as I leave here. And in order to leave enough room, I thought I would speak a little bit shorter and answer more of your questions, because it's usually much more exciting than listening to someone talking the whole time. But I would like to say a little bit about a report that I authored and that was adopted by the majority of the European Parliament unanimously in the Culture Committee, that deals with the role of culture in the EU's external actions. Since the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, the EU is working towards a common European foreign and defense security policy. And we're still experiencing some hiccups, but I think as I fundamentally believe and subscribe to the role that culture plays in open societies, it should also be an integral part of this common foreign and defense policy. I brought a picture today. I don't know if any of you recognize it. Yes? Yeah, can you use the microphone so everyone can hear you?
It's an exhibition in UK from Chinese human rights protector Ai Weiwei.
Exactly. Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist who is very famous and also, unfortunately, has been imprisoned and targeted by the Chinese authorities because of his, alleged crimes, speech, but also now is facing tax fines and other kinds of difficult treatment at the hands of the Chinese authorities. And the reason why I wanted to bring this is because China is investing heavily on the government level in cultural diplomacy. It's opening around 1,000 Confucius centers across the world, and it strongly believes in the power of cultural diplomacy. And even though that message and that image might be much more diverse, the ambition, I think, should be one to keep in mind on the European side. Because on the European side, with the crisis that we're facing, budget cuts that have to be made, and less than very ambitious high representative for common foreign policy, I think we need a little bit more of that ambition in Europe, and it sometimes helps to look at what others do. But what I also think this picture symbolizes is that it's not so much about governments anymore who are able to control the message that they're sending out, or relationships between governments for that matter, but that it's much more about people who can individually connect with each other, and artists also who may have a much stronger message, and as such become sort of ambassadors for where they come from. Because this work of art was heavily criticized in China, and the world now knows about it. And so with the emergence of new technologies, distances can be bridged, people can connect to each other, can mobilize behind common causes, and stories can be shared at the click of a mouse across the world. So I think we're looking at a very, very different world, which also impacts the role that governments and traditional diplomats can play. And it opens up huge opportunities for people, civil society, entrepreneurs, artists, journalists, and students to connect. And whether governments like it or not, their messages can also be amplified and tell their own story. There are roughly two ways in which culture are usually treated. Culture is usually treated in policy frameworks. In Europe, there's a number of programs that deal with culture for its intrinsic values. Exchanges between artists, the fostering of educational and cultural programs, media programs. But at the same time, culture is an integral part of our lives and can also be used as a vehicle to accomplish many more other things, such as development, human rights, free speech. It can also be a way to reach people where official avenues are quite difficult. And so when I was seeking support for the report that I did on the role of culture in the EU's external actions, I tried to be as inclusive as possible, but I do think it's important that we think strategically on the European level. At this moment, because there are a number of different programs, and because foreign policy in Europe has never been thought of from the EU perspective before, there's also a risk of fragmenting the existing programs and lacking sort of a line or a focus. So I believe there's a lot of work to be done, there's a lot of opportunity, and the exciting part of it is that it's no longer a top-down process, but rather a bottom-up. And I think that should be facilitated as much as possible. So I'll leave my introduction there, and I'm happy to answer your questions for about 15 minutes or so. Does anyone have questions? No? Too much Belgian beer? Oh, go ahead.
My name is Ursula, and I'm from Poland. And actually, I wanted to ask if you could shed some light on cultural diplomacy of the European Union. I obviously understand that the eyes of the world are turning increasingly towards China and Asia, but I wanted to ask about our eastern and closer neighbors like Ukraine or Russia. And could you please tell me about the cultural diplomacy undertaken by the EU towards or in these countries?
The neighborhood of Europe is very important for us, the eastern but also the southern, with all the changes that are taking place in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and the Middle East more broadly, and also in our relations with candidate member states. There are different kinds of programs. There are certain cultural aspects in trade agreements that are made with different countries, or in the process of a candidate member state in joining the European Union. So it differs from being included in the Erasmus student exchange programs, or from very, very local programs for fostering free press, for example, which in the countries that you mentioned, the Ukraine, but also Belarus, and other Eastern neighborhood countries are quite a challenge. So the programs that are out there are quite diverse, and it also is a matter of people being able to apply to certain EU programs. It doesn't always have to be official programs like the standards of a trade agreement, but it can also be the opportunity for journalists, for example, to participate in Media Mundus, which is a global media exchange program. So there's a number of programs, and sometimes these programs even have to happen under the radar, because it can be sensitive for people to be associated with receiving an EU grant or being associated with the EU at all. I believe there is sort of a global trend on the part of dictatorial or repressive regimes to try to speak badly of those who have worked with Western organizations. I noticed this in Egypt when I went there over the summer, and there is an organization of young people who have tried to educate Egyptian people in terms of democracy and other human rights. And at one point, and it was actually happened to be when I was there, the government said that they had sold out to Western agents by receiving funds. And their response was, look in our accounting books. I mean, you can see exactly where the money came from, but usually the damage can already be done. So we have to be very sensitive about this too. And in order to create more opportunity and also funding to do such programs, there is now talk of the creation of a European Endowment for Democracy, which would be a fund which would be much more independent of the political lines directly, and would allow for the funding of a number of grassroots initiatives. And I think that that's good, because then the independence of that funding is more guaranteed, and we would have more ways to foster democracy and human rights, which would include cultural aspects, but doesn't only have to be cultural aspects, because personally I think that if human rights are not guaranteed, cultural expression is inevitably hindered and people are inevitably suppressed. So the bottom line has to be respect for universal human rights, and culture is both a part of that and can then flourish when there's more guarantee of those rights. But going back to the picture, it also reminds us that artists and those who are outspoken are often the first to feel the pressure when there's less freedom in a society. So, yeah.
You talked earlier about internet freedom and mentioned China as well in terms of cultural expansion. China is not very well known for internet freedom. And what I want to ask you is, how do you and your colleagues, what external actions does the EU have on this front? Do you work with the Chinese government or the representatives to try to figure out a common way for them to get out of the situation?
Well, I think that's a very tricky issue right now. Many EU countries, but also the United States, have had to rely on China for borrowing money or helping us solve the crisis that we have now. And this will inevitably have a political price. And it's always, there's always a little bit of a tension. It's also kind of a philosophical question that people in this house also differ in opinions about. So some will say, in every EU-China summit, in every encounter, trade mission, etc., there has to be very, very strong mentioning of the human rights violations, and we have to go on and on and on about this. Others say, look, China is undergoing a revolutionary period of development, and we can never expect China to be at the level of freedoms and development that Europe or the rest of the developed world is now. It will take time. And we need to allow them time to move to this point. Personally, I have chosen to address the situation of Ai Weiwei, but also other human rights violations in China in a direct way. But perhaps as a result of cultural differences and certainly as a result of political sensitivities, this doesn't usually render an open conversation. But I do think it's important to keep bringing it up, and especially to look at the relation between trade, economic development, and human rights. Because with the economic development of China, there's a number of opportunities to increase trade. And in a lot of those agreements and products that are traded, certain amounts of freedom are sort of captured, especially when it comes to the internet, because a lot of technology companies that seek to operate in third countries have to sign contracts, have to abide by the rules of the land. We saw this very clearly in Egypt, where Vodafone, a British telecom company, was a majority shareholder of Vodafone Egypt when the Mubarak regime decided to ask all providers to shut down the internet and mobile communications altogether during the uprisings. And the power to do this is already captured in the contract that companies have to sign when they go into that country. And the same goes for countries like China and almost every country. So as these trade relations and economic relations grow, it is important to try to bring in as much guarantee of freedoms as possible, I think, and as politicians we can try to support this. The other side of the medal is that where the EU has high standards of human rights in many cases, or sometimes imposes sanctions, such as in the case of Iran, it's often Chinese companies that take in the space that we leave behind by no longer dealing with certain repressive regimes. And it's questionable whether it improves the human rights situation altogether that way. So these are very, very difficult issues, and it's hard to give one formula, but we have to be very focused on this, and I think it's essential that we try to persuade the Chinese authorities to respect human rights more, and to also show that history hasn't been very merciful for those who are cracking down strongly against their own citizens. 2 more questions. I'll take them at the same time. Go ahead.
Hello. I'm coming from the filmmaking industry, and my question would be concerning the program Media.
Mm-hmm.
So as a filmmaker, we are always looking for fundings, and when there's no possibility to get the fundings in our country, we try at the media program. And the answer they told me is that you have to prove that your product is going to be economically livable. And I'm trying to put a sort of program which is concerning human rights and human violation, and how can I convince them that it's going to be economically livable? It's like paradoxical, you know? Or maybe I'm not going to the right institutions, but then which one should I?
Have you been at the Commission?
No.
No? Ah, okay. Go ahead.
My question is, to what degree do you think cultural diplomacy can affect politics with the external relations between the EU and the Middle East? And also, I want to ask your opinion to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Like, the EU could take a united position regarding some countries like Iran and I think Syria. How come they couldn't take a collaborative position regarding Israel, who is above the law in many issues? Thank you.
All right. About getting funding for a film project, it's something that we don't directly deal with. In the European Parliament, we look at the political aspects. Also, we vote on budgets, but it's really bigger picture. And in a way, that's good, because if we would be involved, it may matter what I think about your film, whether you get money, and that's not the good situation. So this is in a much more sort of distant way from our political convictions. And I would imagine you have to be at the Commission and various programs that they have. I don't know where you sought funding. And if you have to convince them of the economic viability, I don't know how you can, you can do that. Although I do think that we should not always try to look at art through an economic lens. There's a real tendency to try to quantify in financial terms, the value of creative industries. But of course, there's great value in trying and in failing sometimes. I mean, some of the artists that we know as the most famous ones in the world today, I'll take one example, Vincent van Gogh from the Netherlands, where I came from, was starving of poverty when he was alive and was outcast for his outrageous use of colors. So if we would have tried to quantify in terms of money the value of his work, that would have not been in any way proportional to the reputation and the value to our society that his work have brought when we look back. So I would hope that there's also ways to get opportunities to make work and get it financed without only working towards profit. On the Middle East and the way in which we can try to influence politics. There's a few thoughts there. Of course, Europe is very committed to solving the Middle East conflict. I don't think anyone would not like to see that happening. There's just different beliefs in how that should happen and who should take the first step. And this is when I'm just talking about the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But Europe is trying to push the negotiations. We're also very, very critical of the Israeli government. There is a unanimous condemnation of the settlement policies. In fact, it's difficult to move certain more technical dossiers forward as a result of the political tensions. So there's certainly strong opinions about it, and it also has a real impact on the relation between Israel and the EU. But as divisive as it is for the people on the ground, it's almost as divisive for people in this house, unfortunately. So it's very difficult to get a united position, which is what you refer to, because there isn't a united position. On some aspects there is, but not on all. And I wish it were different, but it could also be different in the way that you don't want. So it's just a reflection of the complexity of the problem, I think. And then more broadly, when it comes to North Africa and the Middle East, what I've observed here in the European Parliament is that there has been quite an atmosphere of humility after the uprisings. I think this Parliament has always been vocal about human rights violations. Since I came to this Parliament, we adopted a number of resolutions on human rights violations in several countries in the Middle East, but we all know that more broadly our policies as the EU were focused on our interests, on stability, on migration management, and on other interests that we thought were best maintained and served by these dictators. And there was a price, namely that of our values and that of the human rights of the people on the ground. And so I don't think people now believe that we can deploy all kinds of policies which would influence these countries. Not at all, and that's not our goal either. The new European neighborhood policy seeks to foster partnerships on a much more equal level with the countries in our neighborhood, and sort of based on the model which led to the enlargement of the EU historically, which is the idea that if there's more interdependence economically, there's less reason to fight, and that is translated now in a program that would be summarized by more for more, which means if countries reform more, have better respect for human rights, more democratic standards, respect for minorities, and some other thresholds, that would be sort of rewarded with market access. And that way there could be a more equal partnership where it's not a matter of funding in a one-way stream, but rather helping to build capacities, to create opportunities for people, and then for a fair and balanced trade relationship between the EU and those countries. So that is sort of the model that's now being worked out. But that's not the same as thinking that we can sort of influence societies. I personally believe that the future of countries in the Middle East is eventually in the hands of the people. And we have to make sure that we don't help those who repress these people, but we should also not be under the illusion that we have the ability to steer the outcome of events. So we can only empower and seek to defend fundamental human rights, which we believe are universal. So I'm sorry, but I have to go. I hope you have a good visit to Brussels, that you learn something, and that we can learn from you, and that you'll be back another time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mashaka. Thank you.